we are working our way through Ecclesiastes, and today's devotion is called Kitchen Chaos. And I am going to be vulnerable and admit so that you can see that I am not perfect and some of the mistakes that I have made. So we are on February 26th, day 57, and the morning rinse is Ecclesiastes 3 through 5. So go ahead and read and come on back. Well, the featured verse is Ecclesiastes 5:1. Guard your steps as you go into the house of God, and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil. So I bet when you were reading the morning rinse that you thought that I was going to cover the verses of there is a time of weeping and a time of mourning. I mean, those verses are so popular, and yet I did not feel like God wanted me to focus on that section of the morning rinse. I felt like God wanted me to focus on Ecclesiastes 5:1, and that is what I did. So my question to you is, am I the only one guilty of times when my heart and my actions make me unprepared for worship? You know, obviously we want to worship God in every single thing that we do. The way that we worship should be a daily expression of our life. But I have to admit, I have multiple examples, and I am sure that if my kids and my husband are listening to this, they can shake their head yes and say, she is speaking truth. I have multiple examples of having a bad attitude at church, causing me to not be able to hear the message as effectively, and even behaving in ways I know not to behave. Granted, it's becoming less and less and less frequently, but there have been times where, we've shown up to church and I've had a bad attitude. And this can be caused by various reasons. And sometimes it's no one's fault, but my own selfishness. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and hopefully you can relate to these examples. And if you have examples of your own, feel free to write in the comments or tell me about them. But anyway, my first example pertains to my husband. One Sunday morning, I got upset at him for forgetting to fill up the gas tank the night before. And so we have had this kind of habit of trying to make sure that we didn't have any delays and whatever. And on the way to church, we had to stop and get gas, and it actually made our family late to church. And I do not like being late to places. It's one of my, I don't know, it's part of my personality, and yet my family, they're members of my family that don't actually they're not bothered by being late to things. But me, for my personality, I've had to learn through the years that it's okay. Everything's going to be fine. No one is going to die. Everything is going to work its way out. And if we're a little late to this event or that event, then just relax. But more so frequently, my family has kind of morphed into really trying to make sure that we're not late. And so in this specific example, we were late, and it was a really small mistake. He forgot to fill the gas tank up the night before, and yet I allowed my heart to remain bitter. I showed up to church angry, and when that happened, I blocked what God had to say that day. I am sure that there were some fantastic things that our pastor was saying from the pulpit, and yet I sat there and stewed, not allowing my heart to be fully vulnerable to God in that moment, and blocked basically what God was wanting to say to me. Another example was when one of my daughters forgot to pick out her clothes the night before. Again, this is part of my preparation for church. I like to have my clothes picked out. I like to have the gas filled up. I like to have breakfast ready, all the things ready, because I want to get to church early. Well, admittedly, that morning, everything was going fine peacefully, and we were getting ready for church that day. And then all of a sudden, there was an immediate shift of panic a few minutes before heading out the door because she wasn't ready to go. So we had to figure out what she was wearing and get it all ready, get out the door. And once again, I allowed strife to enter my heart towards a loved one, and the rest of that morning was handled inappropriately, including my attitude at church, because it was somebody else, not meeting an expectation that I had, or it was something that wasn't done the night before or whatever. Finally, I have instances where getting frustrated at myself has caused an issue in my heart. So one example was this specific Sunday morning, I forgot to plan the Sunday morning breakfast. And I grew up and my mom always was up early on Sunday mornings. She had breakfast prepared and they were, I guess, a little added specialness to them, if that was even a word. But this Sunday morning, I forgot to plan. Breakfast was a little chaotic, and this is why I called today's devotion Kitchen Chaos, because on this specific Sunday morning, there was a lot of kitchen chaos. And even though I had inward strife at myself and I was frustrated at myself, I portrayed a lot of outward irritation towards my family on this day. There are many, many reasons we may not arrive at church with a pure heart. If carrying strife is not an issue for you, then what about the opposite of it? We may be one who habitually arrives at church with a prepared heart and on time, and we are walking in the door all ready for worship. But if we are not careful, the opposite can occur because pride can set in, because we know that we are ready. But puffing it up is never right. And God speaks very strongly about guarding our heart against sin, especially when we enter into the house of God. And so we as Christ followers have the Bible as a gauge to measure against. I know back, about a month and a half ago, we had a podcast on here about God's plumb line and how that is his standard. And I'm just reminded of that. And obviously the unsaved or the people who are not Christ followers do not have the same gauge. And so we cannot measure how somebody who is not saved is acting based upon this measuring stick, because we all fall short. And this is why we all need to make a habit of checking our hearts when we are preparing for worship. There's a Bible verse that talks about, do not let the sun go down on your anger. And I know couples that have stayed up till wee hours of the night working through challenges in their marriage because they don't want to go to sleep with anger in their hearts. And how we act towards our friends and how we act towards our loved ones is truly an act of worship. This whole devotion today is about that act of worship of making sure that our hearts are guarded. So let's read that verse again. Guard your steps as you go into the house of God, and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools. For they do not know they are doing evil. And that's how an unsaved person is acting, a fool. But it's saying guard your steps as you go into the house of God and draw near to listen. And when our heart is full of strife and bitterness and frustration, even if someone did something that deserves a correction, we still have a responsibility to respond in a loving fashion. And yet we are supposed to guard our hearts so that we can go into the house of worship and listen to what God is wanting to speak to us. And I have, admittedly so, on multiple occasions, had things in my heart that stopped me from hearing what it was that I was supposed to hear that day. So today's challenge to dig deeper is to commit to a daily heart check. And the reason why I say daily heart check is because we don't go to church every single day, but we worship through our lives every day. And whether that's we worship by how we respond to our loved ones, We worship in even just the songs that we sing in our car. It's a daily act of worship. And so I want you to commit to doing a daily heart check and say, God, do I have any bitterness in my heart at all towards anyone? And if I do, then please remove it from me. Please help me to get rid of that. And if it's at nighttime, before you lay your head down, have that same conversation, but commit to having a daily heart check. We go to the doctor, right? I mean, we go to the physician to have our hearts checked. We go to the physician to have our cholesterol checked. We go to the physician to, have physicals. We go to the gym and work out. Why can't we add this? Repent of any bad attitudes and just say, God, I'm so sorry. When I did this heart check, you revealed some things to me, and repent of it. And ask God to help you guard your heart against these behaviors in the future. This is how we grow. This is how we get closer to Jesus. This is how He wants us to live a life worthy of Him and live a life that has spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that we can hear the voice of Him, so that we can hear what His perfect will is for our lives. And if we harbor on the destructive behaviors like anger and bitterness, it's only going to thwart and block what God has for our lives. And as you pull up your journal tonight, commit to continually checking your heart, especially before attending church, so that when you walk in, you'll be able to have a heart full of worship to hear what your pastor says. And I want to once again encourage you that if you have not yet found a church, I know I had this as a challenge back a month or so ago in this podcast, but if you have not yet found a church to go, I would encourage you to don't let that die. Get out, and you never know who you're going to affect by His kingdom. Oftentimes we can affect people by, being digitally present, but there's also such a powerful kingdom mindset when we are physically present with other believers in our community, making a difference in people's lives. God may need you to be out in the community where you are at right now. And so I am just encouraging you, if you have not yet committed to going to a church, then I'm just asking you to just seek God about it and see if it's, something that you can add to your Sunday morning routine. And if you are attending a church service, but you're not faithful, then start going faithfully. This Sunday, start going faithfully. And if you are going faithfully, then continue to have that daily heart check. And especially when we're walking into church service. Learn from my examples, because I've made some mistakes along the way. People tell me, Anita, you're a pretty open book. You tell all your stuff, and that is true. I oftentimes will tell my mistakes, and yet I feel like if I do that, it will help you guys see that we're all in this together, even when we make mistakes. So I hope today inspired you, and just continually keep growing. And as always, keep rinsing, reflecting, and repeating. God bless you.